that all deserve equal justice under the law, from the privileged to the impoverished. In an imperfect world, the judge conquered so many hurdles, and today stands as one of the most experienced individuals ever nominated to the Supreme Court. For this reason, the judge is also beloved by individuals and organizations across the political spectrum. I went through her record carefully, and never did I find one instance of a peer or colleague or associate say one negative word about her. It was incredible. When we go through these records, you'll often find someone here and there who will badmouth the individual who knew them. Not with just Judge Jackson. And lest we forget, the judge is popular in the minds of the American people. A Gallup poll released after her hearing showed nearly 60% of the public supports her confirmation, 10 points above the historical norm. And there is no question here, the country, by and large, wants the Senate to confirm Judge Jackson. Police chiefs want to confirm Judge Jackson. Conservative and moderate and liberal judges all want us to confirm Judge Jackson. And I thank my colleagues in this chamber who worked in good faith to make sure the Senate can finish its work today. Finally, as I've said many times, the judge belongs on the Supreme Court. By that, I mean something very specific. In our nation's history, 115 individuals have been confirmed by this body to serve on the Supreme Court of the United States. Of those, 108 have been white men. Only 4 have been women. Only 2 have been African American. But Ketanji Brown Jackson will be the first African American woman ever to hold the title of justice. Think about the impact that will have on our democracy. Untold millions of kids will open textbooks and see pictures of Justice Jackson among the highest ranks of our public figures. How many millions of kids in generations past could have benefited from such a role model? How many would-be justices, lawyers, doctors, generals, business people have been lost to history precisely because their history books had few, if any, role models that they could relate to? We certainly have a long way to go on the road to true justice, but by confirming Judge Jackson today, we are taking a bold step forward towards reaching the full realization of our country's promise. We will make it far more likely that girls across America will feel precisely what Judge Jackson felt herself when she was a kid. Nobody can stop me. I can do this too. I am brilliant too. I belong too. For all these reasons, increasing the diversity of the court has been one of my highest priorities and one of the highest priorities of our Senate Democratic majority, of whom I am so proud. Justice Jackson is the most important example, but we've been working on this for over a year. Of the 58 Senate-confirmed federal judges since we took the majority, 3/4 have been women. 2/3 have been people of color. And it's not just racial and gender diversity that matters. We have strived to lift up judges that bring diversity through their experience. More public defenders in our courts, more civil rights lawyers, more election lawyers. When Americans of all walks of life come before the court, they should have confidence that those who don the robes have the ability to walk in their own shoes, to see and understand their side of the story, and then apply the law properly according to the facts. One judge at a time, this majority is expanding the possibility of who merits consideration to the bench. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge my Republican colleagues who joined us on this occasion over the year to achieve this goal. In closing, I want to thank Chairman Durbin for beautifully executing this nomination process. It was equal parts fair, thorough, and expeditious. No easy feat in this modern Senate. I want to thank all of my Democratic colleagues on the Judiciary Committee. You were just fabulous, every one of you, for your respectful and insightful examination of the judge's record. And I want to thank my Republican colleagues who chose to take this process seriously, no matter which side you voted on. The president sent us an impressive nominee. She merited a robust and thoughtful and lively examination. I thank the members who did it precisely that. In short, Madam President, this is one of the great moments of American history. At the time of our Constitution's ratification, in most states, you had to be a white, male, Protestant landowner to be considered part of American society. So from the get-go, generations of Americans have sought to establish the United States as a full democracy. We fought a bloody civil war to end slavery. Women organized and reached for the ballot. The civil rights movement brought an end to the vicious segregation of the mid-20th century. And today, we are taking a giant, bold, and important step on the well-trodden path to fulfilling our country's founding promise. This is a great moment for Judge Jackson, but it is even a greater moment for America as we rise to a more perfect union. I thank my colleagues for their work, and I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, all post-cloture time has expired. The question occurs on the nomination of Ketanji Brown Jackson of the District of Columbia to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There is, and certainly appears to be a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Barrasso. No. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Bennett. Aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mr. Blumenthal. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Booker. Yes. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, no. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, no. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, no. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, no. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton, no. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer, no. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, no. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, no. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, aye. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, no. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mrs. Fisher. No. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mrs. Gillibrand. Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Haggerty. No. Mr. Haggerty, no. Ms. Hassan. Aye. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Hawley. No. Mr. Hawley, no. Mr. Heinrich. Aye. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper. Aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Ms. Hirono. Aye. Ms. Hirono, Aye. Mr. Hoven? Mr. Hoven, no. Mrs. Hyde-Smith? Mrs. Hyde-Smith, no. Mr. Inhofe? Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Kane? Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Kennedy? Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. King? Mr. King, aye. Ms. Klobuchar? Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Langford? Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Leahy? Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Lee? Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Lujan? Mr. Lujan, aye. Ms. Lummis? Ms. Lummis, no. Mr. Manchin? Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Markey? Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Marshall? Mr. Marshall, no. Mr. McConnell? Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Menendez? Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Merkley? Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran voted in the negative. Ms. Murkowski? Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy, aye. Mrs. Murray? Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Ossoff? Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mr. Padilla? Mr. Padilla, aye. Mr. Paul? Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Portman? Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Risch? Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Romney? Mr. Romney, aye. Ms. Rosen? Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Rounds? Mr. Rounds, no. Mr. Rubio? Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Sanders? Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Sass? Mr. Sass, no. Mr. Schatz? Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Schumer? Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida? Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mr. Scott of South Carolina? Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mrs. Shaheen? Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Shelby? Mr. Shelby, no. Ms. Sinema? Ms. Sinema, aye. Ms. Smith? Ms. Smith, aye. Ms. Stabenow? Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Tester? Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Thune? Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Tillis? Mr. Tillis, no. Mr. Toomey? Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Tuberville? Mr. Tuberville, no. Mr. Van Hollen? Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Warner? Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Warnock? Mr. Warnock, aye. Ms. Warren? Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Whitehouse? Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Wicker? Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Wyden? Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Young? Mr. Young, no. Mr. Graham? Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Paul, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 53, the nays are 47, and this nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the president will immediately be notified of the Senate's action.
Madam President, very happily, I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Heads up.
No, you start. You wait till your
Okay.
members get here.
Okay.
Speaking.
I hope we have most everybody. Diane's here. There she is. Here she comes.
Got most everyone here.
I think we did pretty well.
Anybody seen Schumer?
Who is he?
This is a great day for America. Being a senator requires patience and many days of frustration and falling short of the goal so many times. Many people give up, but others don't. You're looking at a committee that never gave up. This is an extraordinary Senate Judiciary Committee. Here we are in a tied Senate 50-50 with this committee at 11-11, and we were asked to help this president bring someone to the Supreme Court to fill a vacancy. We all know from recent history that that is not an easy assignment. And I want to tell you, we were helped immensely by the fact that President Biden picked the most extraordinary individual that I could think of in America. She turned out to be a pillar of strength, to show grace and dignity, and really won over the hearts of the American people. That's not just a feeling, it's reflected in the polling. After our first week, and she's been going through 24 hours of questions, they asked the American people their opinion of her, and it went up. It was positive. She was cool under pressure. She was solid. And she really made the case that to be the first, you have to be the best. So this committee worked long and hard, not only for this nomination, but also for other nominations for courts in the land. We want to make our justice system look much more like America. And today we took a giant stride forward in giving this judge, Ketanji Brown Jackson, her chance, our lifetime chance to serve on the United States Supreme Court. I'm going to turn it over to a former member of the committee who's still always welcome in the committee, but the Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer.
Thank you. Well, I just wanted to, it is just an amazing day. If I had to think of an adjective to describe all of us, it would be elated. Elated because of this wonderful person going on the court. Elated because America, today, the higher angels, as Abraham Lincoln said, held forth and held true. This has been a long, hard road as we try to get to greater equality, less bigotry in America. And there is often steps backward. But when you have a day like this, it inspires you to keep moving forward. There's no better group to have us move forward than this group. I came here to praise the Judiciary Committee, led by Dick Durbin. He just did a fabulous job. And to praise all of the members of this committee. It's just, when you look around and see, it's an amazingly talented group of people. And they showed it. They showed it in this hearing where the challenges were large. Some of the Republicans on the committee treated the witness and the other members respectfully, but some did not. You all saw that. But this committee held their ground, stayed cool, answered respectfully, and beat back the nastiest of arguments. So they should be very proud of themselves because all of the Senate and all of America is proud of them.
Thanks, Chuck.
Thank you.
Pat Leahy, President Pro Tem and former Chairman of the committee.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And first off, having chaired that committee for a number of years, I cannot think of anybody who could have done a better job or would have done a better job than Dick Durbin did. And I must admit, Chair, you kept your temper better than I would have. But I've been here for 21 Supreme Court nominations. And I look at all of them and I look at what we've learned through 21. And here I see somebody extraordinarily well qualified. somebody who make the court look more like America, and somebody, frankly, I could say to my children and my grandchildren, be proud. Be proud of what you see. Because over those 21, I could not help but think it was rare that we broke through and showed the diversity this country should, even though we had some excellent people. But just as proud as I was when I voted for the first woman to go on the Supreme Court, the first Latina to go on the Supreme Court. Now it's come all the way. And I am so happy. I'm so happy that the chair kept us all together. And after 48 years, I'm very, very happy. Thank you.
I want to say one word before we open it to questions, and that is we're here because of extraordinary staff work at every level. Every single one of us relied on the men and women who work here under exceptional circumstances with COVID to work long, long, long hours and to be there when we needed them. I just want to salute them. I think I join in that. Open it to any questions.
Senator Schumer,
Whoops.
excuse me.
What did you say?
What kind of look did you give him?
Is there any legislative answer to anything that happened in this hearing? I'm thinking more toward a number of you commented, I think you did, Mr. Chairman, about the sentencing guidelines that everyone complains about that need reform.
Well, let's start. I'm just going to speak for myself. I haven't even talked to my colleagues on the committee. I just find it, this was a trial by ordeal. She went through 24 hours of questioning. Each one of us had 10-minute opening statements and then 50 minutes minimum, 50 minutes to ask questions. I'm not sure that that is really fair to any nominee, or I don't believe it's necessary. I mean, you don't have to go that far back in history to find nominees who've gone through the Judiciary Committee in a matter of several hours, maybe a day. But now it's become an endurance contest, and I don't think that that necessarily serves the purposes that we're trying to serve. In terms of issues, we have plenty of issues. Some were raised during this hearing and others we're working on. I see my friend Amy Klobuchar here, who is breaking ground in areas of antitrust and raising questions that are central to so many different areas. I can just go around. I know that there's Sheldon, I was looking for you. I know you've got a few ideas for hearings too. Same thing is true in every one of them. What I've tried to do on these subcommittees is to give them the resources and the incentive to plow forward and take on some issues that haven't been touched in a long time. They haven't let me down. We've got an exciting committee. Yes.
Chairman Durbin, a few hours ago on the same platform, Senator Ted Cruz and Senator Lindsey Graham stood there and said that if there was another nominee by this president, President Biden, that was similar to Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, they would not let it go through if they are in the majority. What is your response to that?
Well, of course, we certainly hope they never have that opportunity. We want to continue and build our majority in the November election. And I think the American people supporting this nominee will understand the stark differences which some Republicans would bring to the bench. And I'd also go on to say that, no, I'm going to stop there. That's enough. Yes.
Yeah, don't ruin the joy of the day.
So after the contentious confirmation hearings, you did get 3 Republican votes, but it does seem as if perhaps the era of bipartisan confirmation votes may be behind us. Do you think that going forward we can continue to look forward to contentious hearings and toxic partisanship for every nominee?
First, I can't say enough for the 3, Collins, Murkowski, and Romney. They came through and took grief for it to a measure we rarely see around here. I respect them so much. I held out the hope that at the last minute, several others would join them and realize that they wanted to be on the right side of history at this moment. Didn't pan out that way. We've got to continue to work to build bipartisanship. I'm lucky to have a man sitting next to me on that committee, and Chuck Grassley, whom I count as a friend and as a fair individual. We didn't agree on this nominee, but there are a lot of things we do agree on. we've got to continue to build those bridges. One more question, yes.
Several senators have talked along those same lines about this process being broken in the Senate in terms of evaluating nominees. Are there any specific fixes, changes that you would like to see in the way that the Senate goes about evaluating future nominees to the court to try to get away from the process?
Well, I don't want to give that off the cuff. I'd rather reflect on it. It's changed. I mean, the elimination of the filibuster, the elimination of 60 vote requirement by Senator McConnell changed the selection process very much, made it much more partisan under these circumstances. But before I start talking about options that we can consider, I want to do it in the cool light of the morning when we are not as excited as we are at this moment. And I'd rather do it in that fashion. Thank you very much. Okay, one more.
I just want to ask about your decision-making process. What stood out to you? What was on the forefront of your mind when you decided you'd vote yes to this?
That I would vote yes?
Yeah, any of you guys. Do you have anything that stands out about this now, Justice Jackson?
I believe what I said from the start. If you want to be the first, you have to be the best. This judge brought the strongest conceivable resume. If you ever graduated from law school and someone said you got a chance for a clerkship, you jump at it, right? She had 3 of them at every level of the federal court. And if you said you want a person on the court who has experience as a defender, as a person who has been a district court judge, a circuit court judge, she checked every one of the boxes. And she'd been through the committee 3 times with bipartisan support. She was exceptional, and she had to be, because the first person to ever try to break down a barrier is going to be really carefully scrutinized. So, you know, for me, from the beginning, I thought this president made a wise and strong choice. It's good for America, and she is good for the court. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. I'm going to just follow you.
Yeah.